Alright, this will be a video about 5 wild deathbed confessions. Everything from people claiming they were involved in the JFK assassination to whistleblowers talking about UFOs and Area 51 and other political scandals. And to start out, my confession is I absolutely love deathbed confessions. This is like my ultimate guilty pleasure. These deathbed confession videos and stories pop up every once in a while on social media. A lot of times you see them on 4chan. There'll be some whistleblower who's about to die who decides to just tell everything they know about aliens or some other major mystery from history. And these are usually very entertaining to read and watch. Some of these deathbed confessions definitely seem like they're disinformation, so you do have to take them with a grain of salt, but I just love them, and I figured I'd pick out 5 of my favorites and just talk about them a bit more. So we'll get into it, and first up we have Chauncey Holt, and on his deathbed he talked about what he knew about the JFK assassination, which was a lot because he was in Dealey Plaza the day JFK was killed, and he was involved with the mob and the CIA for his entire life.
Very few people know the incestuous relationship that existed and probably exists at the moment between these various very powerful elements: organized crime, intelligence community.
And in 1997, he gave this deathbed confession only 8 days before he died, and then this documentary was made about him. And this is honestly one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen on the JFK assassination. He just drops a ton of knowledge about the mob and the CIA and the Kennedy killing, and the reason he knew so much was he was in tight with many of the most powerful mobsters from this era. Right here on screen, this is a letter to Chauncey Holt from Meyer Lansky, who basically ran the mob during this era. Chauncey Holt did a lot of jobs for him. And his involvement with the JFK assassination began when he was told to go to Dallas on the day Kennedy would be there to take part in a protest for Cuba that he was told would happen in Dealey Plaza. And this protest would be timed to happen during JFK's motorcade to bring attention to the protest. He was told to travel to Dallas with James Canty, Leo Masseri, and Charles Nicoletti. Charles Nicoletti was a hitman for Sam Giancana and the Chicago outfit, and Chauncey Holt says that he was told these 3 people would join him at the protest. Now, Chauncey Holt claimed he had no idea there would be an assassination attempt on JFK that day. He was just told to go participate in this protest for Cuba. But when he got to Dallas and walked around Dealey Plaza, he recognized just a bunch of underworld figures and contract assassins walking around the area, and he realized something bigger was about to happen. He described the scene in Dallas that day as basically a who's who of mafia people and contract assassins.
So I strolled up by the almost up to the corner of Houston and Elm Street. I was on the south side. I never actually got up there. And I looked over there. I saw individuals that I had seen in the past. One of them, of course, was Luis Posada, who was another assassin. Freddie Lugo, who was also another world-class assassin. I thought that I saw Rip Robertson. He was another, had been he was a CIA contract agent. I mean, it'd be hard to find at the Soldier of Fortune meet. It would be hard to find as many military types that was wandering around in Dealey Plaza. And of course, you really wondered about that. But after all, we were getting ready to have a demonstration, so I thought.
And he later said that he believed that all these people being sent to Dallas at this time was basically a diversion to muddy the waters and make it harder to identify who was involved, since so many criminals and underworld figures just happened to be in Dallas on the day of the shooting.
I've always thought that it was some effort to, muddy the water. We got as many bad guys running around as you can possibly get, and they all seem to gravitate. It just seems to me more than coincidental that they would all show up in Dallas at the same time.
And definitely Chauncey Holt's most incredible claim is that he said he was one of the infamous 3 tramps. So these 3 people who came to be known as the 3 tramps were found hiding in a train car near Dealey Plaza right after the Kennedy assassination. And they were always a huge mystery because they were shown being brought in for questioning by the Dallas police right after the assassination, but the Dallas police claimed that the records of who they were and what they'd said during questioning had been lost. So their identities remained a mystery for decades after the assassination, and there's always been a ton of speculation about who they were. Now, Chauncey Holt claimed he'd been instructed that if the protest he was supposed to attend got out of control or something went haywire, he was told to go hide in a boxcar that would be on some train tracks near Dealey Plaza.
And they were saying if you have any trouble, you go and jump in this boxcar. They identified the boxcar. You get in this boxcar, which will appear to be locked. It'll have a seal on it and everything else, and sweat out what happens if they have some kind of a serious confrontation. When the shooting started at 12:30, then immediately after the first shot, which was a weak type shot, I realized that this was not any simple demonstration. My first was to, hey, just get out of here, just go over, mix with the crowd, and go. But I had been given specific instructions, and when you're given specific instructions, that's what you do. I had enough time to just barely get to the boxcar, and when I arrived there, these two other individuals, known to me as Harrelson and Montoya, were already there. We jumped in the boxcar, closed the door, and just settled down to wait everything out.
Now, the Charles Harrelson that he names as one of the other three tramps is Woody Harrelson's dad, who was a contract hitman. It is a crazy story. He was an assassin for the mob and killed a federal judge in 1979 and spent decades in prison for it. And there really might be something to what he's alleging here, because in this documentary, a forensic investigator named Lois Gibson was interviewed. She was called the world's most successful forensic artist and was considered one of the foremost experts in the world on forensic science. And she compared photographs of the three tramps with Chauncey Holt and Charles Harrelson, and she was certain that they were the people in the three tramps photo.
There is more than just Holt's word. There is also his face.
It's just too close.
Lois Gibson is the Houston Police Department's forensic artist. She made comparisons of Holt and the tramp in the photographs.
This is just conclusive to me that that's the same man.
She also compared pictures of Charles Harrelson with the tramp photo. Again, a perfect match.
I'll stake my reputation on it for sure.
So like I mentioned, the identities of these three tramps were a total mystery for like 30 years. There was a ton of speculation on who they were. And then in the early 90s, and this was right as Chauncey Holt was making all this noise about being one of the three tramps, the Dallas police just kind of out of the blue announced that they'd magically found the identities of the three tramps in their files. And they claimed it wasn't Chauncey Holt or Charles Harrelson, but just three homeless people from Dallas who had nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination. And again, they just kind of randomly found these records almost 30 years after the assassination, after the identities of these tramps were a mystery that entire time. And this is kind of used to discredit Chauncey Holt because people say, oh, he was lying about the identities of these three tramps, therefore he doesn't have any credibility, so everything he says in this documentary is false. But I definitely question the Dallas police identifying these three tramps after such a long time. And I mean, Chauncey Holt just goes into so much detail about the mob and the JFK assassination in this documentary. It would be about impossible to just make all this up. He named Sam Giancana, Johnny Rosselli, and Charles Nicoletti as three of the main people involved in some way with the JFK killing. And very interestingly, all three of these guys were murdered during the House Select Committee on Assassinations investigation that was re-examining the JFK killing in the late 1970s. And they were all killed before they could be questioned by the committee. So it definitely seems like they knew some secrets about the JFK killing, and they were murdered to prevent them from telling them. And I will say I talked more about Woody Harrelson's dad, Charles Harrelson, in this video I did about 5 celebrities with strange backgrounds. And his dad's story is just insane. He was quite literally a contract killer who spent the last part of his life in prison. It really is such a crazy story. I'll link this video in the description. But this Chauncey Holt documentary, I definitely recommend it. It's one of my favorite things about the JFK assassination. And for the next deathbed confession, we will stay on the topic of the JFK assassination and talk about a deathbed confession made by E. Howard Hunt. So E. Howard Hunt, you probably know the name. He was a real mysterious CIA-type figure who just kind of pops up in a lot of major stories and controversies throughout the 1960s and 70s. He was sentenced to prison for being one of the main people involved in the Watergate break-in, and he served 33 months in prison. I always love it when a random 33 appears. It's my favorite number. It's a number that pops up a lot in news stories. And he's rumored to be the guy behind just a ton of other events from this era. If you remember the cigarette-smoking man from the X-Files, it was said that his character was based on E. Howard Hunt. And another really interesting thing about him is he published just a ton of spy novels and novels about political conspiracies. A lot of these are James Bond type novels, and I've always been so fascinated by the fact that he published all these books. You do wonder if he was including real life stories in these books. Definitely let me know in the comments if you've ever read any of these books. I've always been so intrigued by them, but I've actually never read any of them, and I'd love to know if they're actually worth the time. So E. Howard Hunt, he was a real man of mystery and intrigue, and in 2007, he gave a deathbed confession about everything he knew about the JFK assassination, and this ran in Rolling Stone magazine. And he claimed he wasn't really involved himself, he just described himself as a quote-unquote bench player who would be used if needed. He did list out the major people he claimed were involved, and a lot of these people are people who have long been rumored to be involved in the JFK assassination. Almost all of them have CIA ties. He claimed Lyndon Johnson was one of the main people behind the plot because he wanted the presidency for himself. But overall, this confession of Howard Hunt's is honestly pretty weak. He just doesn't really provide much in the way of evidence that backs up what he says. He pretty much just lists out a bunch of names, but doesn't really provide any details. But what I did find interesting about this list is that there's no real overlap with the names mentioned by Chauncey Holt and the names mentioned by Howard Hunt. They pretty much list out totally different people being involved in the JFK killing. And that's kind of like typical of the JFK assassination. It's almost impossible to look into because there's just so much conflicting information out there. But I did want to mention this Howard Hunt confession because it's a pretty well-known deathbed confession. I do think a lot of times these deathbed confessions are used to mislead or distract people or pass disinformation. And that's kind of what I think it seems like with this E. Howard Hunt confession. It got all this media attention when it happened, and it ran in Rolling Stone magazine, which is definitely compromised. This comment here on the article, I got a kick out of this, and it kind of sums up what a lot of people think about this confession. Somebody posted, "What a great story. I don't believe a word of it." So overall, this E. Howard Hunt confession is pretty well known, and it got a lot of attention when it happened, but it's one of those deathbed confessions that a lot of people really question how legit some of this stuff that he talks about really is. And next up, switching to the topic of Area 51, we have Boyd Bushman, who made a deathbed confession about UFOs and aliens back in 2014.
My name is Boyd Bushman. I'm a senior scientist from Lockheed Martin. I have 27 patents.
And Boyd Bushman, he was a real person. He had a very renowned career. He was a senior engineer for Lockheed Martin and Hughes Aircraft as well. Always love it when a random Howard Hughes reference appears. And he also graduated with a master's degree from BYU, so there's a Mormon connection with him too. And he was credited as one of the inventors of the Stinger missile and also of some important aircraft defense systems. But most interestingly, he claimed that he had top secret security clearance at Area 51. And in 2014, he released a deathbed confession where he shared a bunch of details about the projects he'd been involved with and information that he'd been passed by people that he used to work with.
Approximately 13 years ago, I ran across a person who had been given a job by Dr. Teller. Dr. Teller was Oppenheimer's right-hand man. And even after Oppenheimer was thrown out of Area 51, Dr. Teller stayed there. The person that I contact twice to three times per month is the head of that program now. And they continually update me on everything they possibly can. I do have a top secret clearance.
And the focus of his work was reverse engineering the anti-gravity technology that was used by an alien aircraft that had crash-landed on Earth back in the 1950s. And he talked about the construction of the aircraft and said this technology was so advanced that the aliens could travel from their home planet, which was 68 light years from Earth, in less than an hour.
Their home planet is Quintonia, which is 68 light years from us. They, to my surprise, when I asked them how fast they take to get from that, it should be 68,000 years to make it according to Einstein. But they're able to make it to us in 45 years.
And he misspoke there. He later corrected himself and said it was 45 minutes that it took them to travel 68 light years. And he also had a bunch of pictures that he claimed were of the aircraft. But the photos that really got people talking were pictures of the alien beings who were living at Area 51. And he claimed these aliens were 4.5 to 5 feet tall, and at least 18 of the beings lived and operated in the Area 51 facility. One or two of them were about 230 years old, and he said he'd interacted with them and they communicated by telepathy. So it's obviously pretty wild that he had photos of these alien beings, but this is also where his testimony became controversial because people looked into this and they found a doll that was sold at Kmart that looked exactly like the alien in this photo. So there was this debate on, well, was this guy just playing people for fools and sharing photos of a doll? Was he basically a disinformation agent? Or some people wondered if he was being passed fake photos that he didn't realize were fakes because all these photos he was sharing, he'd been given to them by other people at Area 51. Or a third explanation, and this was probably the most interesting one, was that these alien photos were legit, that this was an actual alien, and then this doll was made to look like these real aliens and sold in stores because that would be the perfect way to discredit anyone who tried to leak these photos of the real alien. You make this doll that looks like the real aliens and you say, nah, those photos are fake. That's no alien. It's a doll. And that would discredit anyone who tried to leak these real photos of the actual aliens. So the legitimacy of these alien photos is what most people focus on with Boyd Bushman, but his whole talk is really interesting. He is very knowledgeable about aircraft technology, and he seems genuine. He seems like he really believes what he's saying, and he's not just trying to deceive people. And this whole question of what's legit and what isn't ties in with this book about Dulce, New Mexico. This was written by the son of Gabe Valdez, who was an investigator who went really hard into investigating cattle mutilations in the 1970s and the underground Area 51 type base that's in Dulce, New Mexico. And there have always been stories about aliens and UFOs at this underground base, and the basic conclusion of this book is that all the stories about aliens were disinformation to distract people from what was really going on at the base, which was the development of super advanced aircraft technology. And there was a whole disinformation team at the Dulce base who would leak, quote unquote, leak information about aliens to get people to focus on that instead of looking into the advanced aircraft technology that was being tested at the base. So something like that could have happened with Boyd Bushman. He could have been fed this alien story and these photos to discredit him because when he talks about things like the anti-gravity technology that he worked on, that really does seem legit. The alien stuff is a little more controversial. It very well could be legit, but there are some questions about that part of his confession. But overall, definitely recommend this interview of his. It's a really good one. And next up is a deathbed confession about the moon landing being faked. This video was released back in 2022 by a guy named Eugene Akers, who claimed he was dying of cancer and knew some details about the moon landing being faked back in the late 1960s.
So this is my deathbed confession because now I'm dying of cancer. I've got cancer all over the place, and they don't know where it's coming from, and I don't know if they can stop it, but it don't look good. So I'm going to go ahead and make this video for Bart Cybrell. He knows not to do anything with it until notification of my death.
So Eugene Akers said his father was head of security at Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico in the 1960s, and in 2002, his father was dying and told him that the moon landings had been filmed in a hangar at the base.
Okay, anyway, this is the story that my dad told me on his deathbed. Project Slam Dunk was the name of this. President Johnson in 1968, okay? In Cannon Air Force Base in 1968, he said by the time he got there, that there was already 2 large hangars that were connected.
His father said he guarded the door of the hangar where the moon landing was filmed in, and he had a list of 15 people who were allowed into the hangar for the filming.
Dad was one of 3 guards that guarded the inside of the front entrance. There was a list of 15 people who could enter. No one else was allowed by order of President Johnson. And here is that list, and I gave it to Bart Seibel as well. President Johnson, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Alden, Werner von Braun, Robert Emenegger, Gene Kranz, James Webb, Joe Kerwin, Dr. Thomas Paine, Glenn Looney, Dr. Christopher Kraft, Dr. James Van Allen, General Trudeau, Lieutenant Colonel Donald Simon, and Grant Norrie.
And his father said he was threatened with prison if he ever revealed anything about this, but in 2002 he was dying and he filmed a video confessing everything that he knew about the moon landing being faked. So Eugene Akers started researching what his father told him, and he claims he started getting harassed by the government. There was a fire at his house that ruined the tape of his father's original confession, and he thought that could have been set on purpose, and he was also threatened by some government people who showed up to his house.
People broke into my house 2 times. I was visited by men with black suits, and I was told in no uncertain terms to drop this whole project, not to say anymore to anybody, or me and my wife and my son could disappear.
And then decades later, in 2021, Eugene Akers was dying himself, and he filmed this deathbed confession to retell what his father had told him years earlier. And he gave this tape of his confession to Bart Seibel, who's probably the most well-known researcher into the moon landings being faked. He's published a ton of books and documentaries about it and appeared on the Joe Rogan show to talk about the moon landings being faked. And Eugene Akers specifically requested that the videotape of his confession not be released until he died, which he did die in 2022, and the tape was released. It's a pretty short video, about 15 minutes long or so, and there's nothing really too explosive in it. He does provide details like the dates that the moon landing was filmed, where it was filmed, but his dad's role was just to guard the door and let people in, so he wasn't involved firsthand in the filming. And he claimed they brought in hundreds of tons of sand and debris and then put cement powder on top of it to replicate the moon surface. And there was a bunch of construction going on at the base at the time, so a bunch of dump trucks hauling sand and debris wasn't questioned. The list of 15 names is probably the most interesting part of his confession. Most of these people are involved in the UFO realm or they're recognizable names, and he does provide some documentation like pictures of his dad in his Air Force security uniform and his badge with his badge number, so that at least lends some credibility to it. I'll also say that Bart Seibel, he is just public enemy number 1 for people who defend the moon landings. So you would think that if this was some obvious hoax, they would be all over exposing that and discrediting him. But there really wasn't anything out there that presented anything compelling that I could find that this was all a hoax. So it's definitely interesting. Got to take it with a grain of salt like everything else, but certainly worth 15 minutes of your time to check it out. And lastly, we have Lee Atwater. He was an aide for Ronald Reagan and was campaign manager for George Bush's 1988 presidential bid. He was a real young guy, considered very up and coming, but he died at only 40 years old in 1991. And on his deathbed, he made a shocking confession about the Gary Hart political scandal from the 1988 election. And this whole Gary Hart scandal is such a crazy story. I already did a video about it. I'll link it in the description, but I'll just run through the basics here real quick and then talk about who Lee Atwater was and what he said on his deathbed. So Gary Hart was a senator from Colorado who was running for president as a Democrat in the 1988 election, and he was basically destroying the competition, which interestingly included Joe Biden running for president all the way back 40 years ago. This poll for the Iowa caucus had Gary Hart getting 65% of the votes and Jesse Jackson in second place with 9% of the votes. So it was basically a guarantee that Gary Hart was going to win the Democratic nomination, and he was honestly considered the front runner to win the presidency too. George Bush was considered a borderline awful candidate because Iran-Contra was a massive controversy that was going on at this time, and Bush was seemingly very involved in that. And Bush was also former director of the CIA, and a lot of people just don't really trust anything associated with the CIA. So Gary Hart was the front runner. He was considered the favorite. And then in early May of 1987, a photo of Gary Hart on a yacht in Miami with a girl who was definitely not his wife appeared on the front page of the Miami Herald. And this story just went nuclear. It was covered everywhere. The girl in the photo was named Donna Rice. She turned into a minor celebrity herself, and the yacht he was photographed with her on was named Monkey Business. The shirt he's wearing there says Monkey Business Crew, which is obviously a pretty funny name, and it just kind of added to how surreal and strange the story was. But the story continued to get a ton of coverage, and within a week, Gary Hart dropped out of the race and his political career was totally destroyed. And this basically handed the presidency to George Bush because the other Democrats were considered very weak candidates and almost like fallback options. And I talked about this in the video I did, but this Gary Hart scandal had such a big impact on so many future events because had this scandal not happened, there most likely never would have been a George Bush presidency in 1988, and Gary Hart would have most likely run for re-election in 92, which meant there would have been no 1992 Bill Clinton presidency, maybe no Bill Clinton presidency at all. Plus, if George Bush was never elected, maybe George W. Bush wouldn't have been elected in 2000, and obviously things would be very different if there was no Bush presidency in 2000 or 2004. So this whole Gary Hart scandal really had such a huge impact on the political landscape of the past couple decades, and 30 years after it happened, there was a deathbed confession that revealed some pretty shocking things about how this went down. And this was actually a double deathbed confession. There were two of them. And the first deathbed confession happened in 1991, and it was made by Lee Atwater. And again, he was the campaign manager for George Bush's 1988 presidential campaign, and he had a reputation as being like a really dirty type political guy who would just do a lot of smear campaigns and negative ads, things like that. And he died of a brain tumor in 1991 at only 40 years old. He was very young, and on his deathbed, he confessed that he had set up Gary Hart and the monkey business yacht trip that ruined his campaign. And he was very weak at the time, so he didn't go into specifics, but it was well known that Gary Hart was a womanizer. Pretty much everyone in Washington, D.C. knew that he cheated on his wife all the time, so it was apparently a pretty easy thing to pull off. Now, Lee Atwater gave this confession to Raymond Strother, who was a really powerful Democratic political consultant, and he was kind of like Lee Atwater's counterpart in the 1988 election. Even though they were rivals, they'd remained close after the election, and Raymond Strother visited Lee Atwater just a few days before his death, and this is when Lee Atwater confessed this to him. Raymond Strother mentioned what Lee Atwater had told him to some friends, but he didn't really do much with the information. Again, this was 1991, and it had been 4 years since the scandal, so it wasn't really that big of a deal anymore. And then in 2017, Raymond Strother himself was dying, and a journalist visited him for an article about his career, and Raymond Strother told this story of Lee Atwater giving this deathbed confession to him decades earlier. And the story got a little coverage, really not much though. It was almost like it was being purposely ignored because it really should have been a pretty big story that this campaign manager for George Bush was admitting to setting this up. Even if you look at Lee Atwater's Wikipedia page, both his deathbed confession and the Gary Hart scandal are not mentioned at all, which is honestly almost incredible. But it's definitely a heck of a deathbed confession, and this whole Gary Hart, Donna Rice scandal is just so much bigger than what I've covered here. Donna Rice was linked to the Prince of Monaco and Adnan Khashoggi, a bunch of celebrities like Don Johnson, and there's a lot of indications that she was a call girl. Definitely check out that longer video I did. I'll link it in the description if you want to learn more about this full Gary Hart story. So there you have it. Those are 5 of my favorite deathbed confession videos. Please do let me know in the comments if you know of any other good ones, because like I said, I absolutely love these deathbed confession videos and stories. There's a lot of really good ones out there, and it's just a total guilty pleasure of mine. So let me know if you know of any other good ones. And then lastly, big shout out to the subscribers on Patreon and the members here on YouTube. Thank you so very much for your support. Really, truly, greatly appreciate it. Really means a lot. So thanks again. Hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you soon with another one.